This is Dean Wilson, retired sheriff, Delaware County, and I'm talking in regards to a post I did on Facebook here not too long ago, and of the situation that I witnessed both when I was sheriff and seeing the dramatic turn of the California State Department of Justice and how under the attorney generals, they had began to turn the Department of Justice from a law enforcement body into a enforcement political arm of the DNC, and had begun to utilize and charge, moving away from the criminal enforcement towards suits, actions, legal actions against companies, corporations, and in many cases getting settlement dollars from those cases, and then through mechanisms making sure that those dollars got funneled to programs, non-governmental organizations that were primarily operated, run, funneled through, or by the Democratic committees. We saw that it started back in 1996 with the settlement that dollars that they got that created the California Foundation, which received $3.2 billion. That's $billion from Blue Cross. The California Foundation, when it was initially set up, of course, one of the things that I have to tip my hat and all respect for with the Democrat Party is they do a wonderful and marvelous job of getting their power players and moving into these committees and organizations, whether you're talking about governmental organizations, bureaucracies, or whether you're talking about these foundations that then control the dollars, so that they make sure that the dollars that are placed into these settlement funds get dispersed out and moved into those programs that are overseen, controlled by the Democrat Party. And when you're talking about $3.2 billion, this is a great deal of money to have control over and to utilize throughout the state of California to the betterment of the Democrat Party and to push their social justice agenda. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, we've seen how the Department of Justice in not only California, but in many other blue states where the attorney generals have been placed, that are Democratic attorney generals within largely blue majority states, how they have taken to file suits against the federal government, whether it's immigration or whether it's against gun issues or whether it's against funding issues against the wall. It doesn't matter. What they've done is they've basically turned the Attorney General's office into just a political arm of the DNC, as opposed to truly being a Department of Justice. Justice is supposed to be neutral. Justice is supposed to be blind. Justice is supposed to be non-political, non-partial, and neutral, and objective in as much as it can be in its determination as to what it seeks out. Recently, we have seen some action taken through Congress on the federal level. I've been talking about the state level here in California, but we have seen this especially under Eric Holder, where the same activities that we had seen in California for a good number of years had been taking place under the Department of Justice when Eric Holder was in charge. You're talking about settlements after 2008, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, $3 billion in settlement dollars from them You're looking at $150 million that has been moved out, basically utilized. They said within 1 year, just the last year, $880 million being allocated to what they had termed, not me, but the Wall Street Journal had termed left-leaning organizations. I know locally, through the California Foundation, both True North and Building Better Communities have all been funded through that foundational dollars, as well as other dollars being funneled to them through settlement dollars. Now, under the federal government, one of the nasty things that they do is once they took, the Department of Justice would take a firm, whether it was J.P. Morgan or Bank of America or any of these other cases forward, that the settlement was by agreement. They would be given a 2-for-1 credit for every dollar they donated to any of these non-governmental organizations on their approved lists. They would get $2 for every $1 credit for their settlement funds. So if they owed $150 million on a settlement, they could settle this completely by paying $75 million to these non-governmental organizations that were approved and were all left-leaning organizations, those that preferred or that were overseen by the Democrat type of organizations. So what you're basically seeing is not a neutral body, not a judicial body, settling so that the money would either A, go back to the government and pay down our enormous debt, or actually go back to the victims of those crimes, or of that suffered under the hands of the banks or under the hands of the health of the Blue Cross. It didn't go back to, the money didn't go back to them. Much of that money was diverted into these settlement dollars that, again, basically just acted as a slush fund for the DNC.
Can you tell me a little more about what the settlement dollars, what does that mean? In other words, is it actually court settlements or?
Yes, they're actually court settlements.
That's a lot of court settlements. That's amazing. And a lot to channel off, it sounds like, to target or channel to go to one place, I guess you could
Well,
say.
it goes to multiple places, and it's not one. It's La Raza got $1.5 million. Several other well-known, left-leaning groups got more, but many of it again went to a lot of programs in various cities throughout. Most of them, like St. Louis or Baltimore or Chicago or Detroit. Many of the L.A. Many of them. And a lot of the dollars went to promote voter registration. Now, I know, just from my observations locally, when you saw these organizations, whether it was True North or others operating, they were getting their marching orders from the Democrat Central Committee booth. So they were, going out, acting basically raising votes or assigning voters, but definitely with a direction towards the Democrat Party and not, overall general purpose. So this gives the Democrat Party a huge advantage dollar-wise, and all this money is off the books. So this is not going through any government budget. It's not overseen by any government agency. These are settlements, and because they're settlements, not only do the organizations that pay these settlement dollars, they get to write these as donations because they are voluntarily settling. These are voluntary settlements, so they get, not only do they get the credit for it, but the Department of Justice, Federal Department of Justice, gives them a 2-for-1 credit. So it encourages them, incentivizes them to make sure that the dollars go to these approved non-governmental organizations. And emails recently uncovered in the federal government show the animus directing out of the Department of Justice, particularly for democratically approved programs and to not allow the dollars to go to conservative programs. So, this was not, fair. This was not just. This was in no way do we talk about neutral. This was definitely skewed for a specific purpose. And when you have a justice system that is directly moving for a purpose, and that purpose is purely political, then you no longer have neutral justice. And when we lose our law, then we as a civil society are lost. We no longer have a neutral body out there that is supposed to be neutral. We see this clearly in what has happened to the president when he took office and the actions prior to his arrival, where the Department of Justice and utilizing foreign entities to enter into spying operations into the Trump organization, because it was illegal for the CIA to do anything of that nature. And so in order to make it abide by the law, they went to England and Australia and utilized their assets and their resources and their ability to intercept communications and do so because it's legal for them to do it, but it's illegal for us. And it's not like something that we haven't done. The United States has done this. We did it to Angela Merkel. We did it to England. We did it to all of our many countries that are on our friends list. But we have spied on them. And but this was the first time that we know of categorically where, for a political purpose, for a political advantage, that we used foreign assets to spy upon a presidential candidate prior to office for the sole purpose of benefiting a political party. And they used not only the State Department, but the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the CIA, and the resources of foreign entities in order to get this done.
So why is that a surprise?
Well, it is a surprise, but it's a frightening reality that we have to come to terms with, because when we lose
So how can
neutral justice, when a political party, has the ability to control your Justice Department and it's acting as a political arm of that department, then we're no different than the Soviet government, where we're locking up those that differ and disagree with us.
How can that be a surprise? Because literally we've listened to this kind of behavior out of the federal government for decades. It's not anything new.
But not so brass. This is to have it. I mean, we know that that J. Edgar Hoover, for personal reasons, engaged in surveillance of many individuals that had political power, social and political power, for the purposes of knowledge, but also for purposes of having control. It's not something unusual, but it is, like I say, to this scope and at this level, to have it so brass, it's.
I think the only reason it's portrayed as being brass in this day and age is because it's become so evident, even with all of the shielding that happens from your legacy media and from your politicians themselves. I mean, you get little bits and hints of it on a regular basis, even though the news media tries to disguise it as something else. But, it's pretty evident that the federal government, state governments, local governments all apply the same kind of modus operandi, so to speak, to gain political advantage. And if they have to use law enforcement, that's just all part of the process. I mean, I have no faith in we're not talking about the guys that are in uniform in a police car or in a suit running down drug dealers. We're talking about people at the highest levels of all levels of government. We're talking about the CEOs, for want of a better term, and their assistants and that sort of thing. The government the federal government and the state governments and even local governments have gotten so large, how do you root out that level of corruption? I mean, we're talking about, third world banana republic type behavior here.
And that's one of the things I clearly saw when I was sheriff, and the change that we saw not only in the Department of Justice here in the state of California, where the large part of it was looking towards the criminal case prosecutions, establishing the crime labs throughout the state of California, establishing laws and standards within the state. But it took a dramatic turn while I was sheriff, and they basically almost did away with the criminal justice portion, the crime portion of it, and turned completely towards and focusing in on, going after companies, corporations, and others as a way of generating dollars and focusing on the money and not on, trying to enforce crime anymore.
I mean, you got the same issue with your law enforcement, but you have the same problem in your judicial system too, where you got judges that rule just absolutely irrationally about various things that make no sense. I mean, you can't even make sense out of the readings of their rulings as to what their standard is in terms of making the ruling in the first place. It's all a lot of garbage in most cases.
Yeah, I agree. You can't, especially when there's no basis in either by sticking to what the Constitution says, or even going by what, in many cases, what prior case law has established.
Now, was that while Kamala Harris was the...
Both Kamala, yes, prior to her taking office, but yes, with Kamala especially.
I kind of like to bring this down to the common man for a moment.
Sure.
I'm hearing what you're saying, and one of the glaring things that pops into my head is the Council of Nicaea, when they started arguing about what was and what was not going to go into the Bible before it was written. But nature abhors a vacuum. And if you want to talk about a vacuum, you could talk about quote-unquote smoke-filled rooms. This is a long-standing function of politics. You can go out of sight, out of mind, as long as it happens in the dark of night. You have no control. You can even look at our schools where children are sequestered and indoctrinated. We've talked a number of times about the liberal people in our school systems. Somewhere along the line in antiquity, people recognized that if you make an agreement between another party and make it the law of the land, all of a sudden you have a kingdom. There was such a thing that was called golf, invented in maybe Scotland, maybe. It's a favorite pastime of our current president. But the origin of the word is gentlemen only, ladies forbidden. Now, you can say that's true or not. It does talk about the sequestration of thoughts, ideas, and people talking about the links. The links, that means the network, a network of people talking together. I go to the Coastal Commission and find this small, obscure little problem in Southern California, and the next thing it explodes statewide. How did that happen? Bias, political leverage. People have found out, as I have noticed in both the City Council and the Board of Supervisors, if you want to know what's going on, you have to attend and find out and listen. And if you don't, guess what? Things will happen without your consent, without your objection. You won't get a vote in the matter. When you talk about these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, there are agreements. Agreements are a marvelous thing when they are necessary in a certain moment, you have an agreement. We have MOUs, which are memorandums of understanding, another name for an agreement. But when an agreement enters into the gray area, that becomes a regulation that is backed by the force of law, and we have the code of federal regulations. This is almost a parallel or a companion guide to our law system, which has really no force of law, and yet it does, which is kind of a paradox. A law is a law. A regulation it's more of a guideline, but if it's backed by a law, like a constitutional law, then all of a sudden now this regulation is not a regulation. It's a law. And when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of regulations, both on the state and federal level, you gotta watch where you step.
Oh,
Well, and
absolutely. And one of the things I talked about earlier, it was what the Democrats had done tremendously efficiently, which is to get onto these committees and boards and organizations. I mean, you look at the Department of Energy. Originally was designed to promote and develop energy. Today, what is it? It promotes clean energy. It was trying to pass regulations and did for a time to destroy the coal industry, to destroy much of the fossil fuel industry, and try to funnel vast amounts of dollars towards what they consider green energy. But in many cases, it was basically a way of pushing money towards the favored sector and provide them with billions of dollars. You look at the fishing game used to be purely within the kind to promote the fishing and hunting, sport fishing and hunting. And you look at what it is today, and it is a conservation eco organization. It is no longer really out there trying to promote hunting and fishing. Mm-hmm. You look at whether it's the EPA, or you're looking at the Chamber of Commerce or the Commerce Department. All these agencies no longer, in many cases, no longer function the way that they were originally written or intended to. And their agendas, their policy, their direction has been totally morphed into something that more or less aligns with the social justice agenda, correct way of action, as opposed to what the originally bureaucracy was intended to do. And again, this is an action, a design, pushing an agenda and a policy that is very effective. It doesn't matter who's in charge, whether it's a Republican president or a Democrat president. It doesn't matter. The bureaucracy will continue to perform in the way it does, either pushing its own agenda, whether or not it's the agenda of the administration in office. It will continue to operate, and as we're seeing today, and in many cases, these bureaucracies are actively resisting the new administration's direction that it's trying to push it in, because the bureaucracy, whether it's those in the immediate upper tier or those in the policy and enforcement and writings, these are the individuals that have control over these organizations. And it doesn't matter who's in charge, because the organization will exist long before it has existed before they come in, and it'll exist after they go, and will continue to push their agenda, whether quickly or slowly.
It's pretty bleak. It's a pretty bleak proposition that you've placed before us, that basically what you're saying is we have no control over our own government.
When you have unelected bureaucrats,
Yeah.
that have the power that they can control at this point, at this level,
Yeah.
it's very, it's going to require, a major change in government.
Well, I think most people, without even knowing it, have probably faced this kind of bias without even being aware of it in many cases.
Oh, absolutely.
Assuming that, this is the way things were. I mean, I've certainly experienced it. And I bet you everybody in this room has experienced it at one time or another, maybe multiple times.
Yes.
Well, one of my favorite icons, though, until I found out its actual roots, was a movie called V for Vendetta. And it comes back to me mostly because there was I don't know what you call it, a small speech that was given in the middle of this movie about Guy Fawkes, and he said, you know, right now we're having a problem. The system is not working, and you look into and you ask yourself, how did it get this way? And he said, you know, flat out, he says, if you're looking for the cause of the problems that we have right now, you need only look into the mirror.
Oh, that's very true.
Because it's not necessarily that, you know, the system, while it might have, you might think it has a life of its own, a lot of time it's more of a stamping out small forest fires. It is a patchwork of small term effects for long range problems until it becomes a monster. We probably didn't have that much of a problem until with the fish and game, hunting and fishing, until somebody abused it. And they say, well, we have to put a stop to that. It's like the access to the beach with the Coastal Commission. It's a small little problem, but if you look at it and you telescope it out, you say, well, if it happened here, it can happen there and there and there. And the next thing you know, you have to make a blanket solution for a small problem, and now you've restricted the rights and freedoms of the whole mass. And wait a minute, that's not the way it was supposed to work. Well, we can't go backwards. We never have gone backwards. Repealing is not in our vocabulary.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the real reasons why I know that the resistance that our current president is seeing, why it is so strong, you know, why it is so incessantly, you know, never-ending barrage, you know, trying to drive him out of office. And it's because both parties, both the Republican and the Democrat Party, view him as a clear threat. They view him as someone from the outside that does not and has not played on the team.
Rail against the dying of the light.
Right. And what I learned very quickly when I was sheriff and visited Sacramento several times a year, whether it was for lobbying purposes or just for meetings, but to go down there, I quickly come to realize that there was really no difference between those in the Democrat Party and those in the Republican Party. There was really no major change between the two. That it was all about the ability to keep and control power.
This is the lamb sitting between the two wolves.
Yeah, keeping and
about
controlling power, and who was going to determine where the money went. And that was all they were worried about. They weren't worried about how my life in Delaware County was going to be affected. They weren't worried about their constituents and what was going to happen to them. There was few that I met or saw in underneath the dome that actually honestly were there for the constituents. There were a few, and they were wonderful people to meet, but so few. Most of it was about party, and most of that came down to how do we control and keep power within the organization. And unfortunately in California, we have no wars or battles being fought anymore. The Democrat Party has total control, and the only fight is between which faction within the Democrat Party is going to pull enough weight to get the money directed in the way that they want.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely is a popular phrase. Supposedly, and it has been brought to some people's attention that politicians are basically our servants. They are elected.
Supposed to be.
Yeah, they're supposed to be working for us. The absolute power according to the Constitution, to the best of my knowledge, lies with the people. However, the people are basically feeling pretty powerless. This gave rise to the initiative process back in the 60s and 70s, where the people said, not so fast. We, the people, are going to put together a petition and a drive, and we have a couple of paralegals out there that'll bring our case before the court, well, whether it's a local court or a regional court or the Supreme Court. The mouse that roared actually had a voice. However, those days are pretty much gone.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've seen the deleterious effects that the initiative process has wrought upon us. With we talked about this last with the homeless issue, and that, in my opinion, was a self-inflicted gunshot wound by the state of California, by voters on themselves. One was started with AB 109, but then we did it to ourselves with the Safe Schools Act and 54 and 31. These initiatives that basically changed the entire judicial system and decriminalized the low-level drug offenses, so that what we see now on our city streets and what we see in our communities, where petty theft of anything under basically short of $1,000 now is petty theft, and most of those crimes will never get prosecuted. Most of them will never get charged in the court. And so you see, petty theft crime. You see open utilization of drugs, even those that are still illegal, whether it's heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine. You see it openly being utilized. You're seeing, people living on the streets, basically because it is much easier for them to do the things that they choose to do, to steal, to take whatever money they do through EBT or whatever, and utilize it in a manner that's going to be their preferred choice, which is drugs and alcohol,
right?
And continue to live in that lifestyle. And because we've virtually decriminalized all that behavior, law enforcement no longer enforces it. District attorneys no longer prosecute. And so what we're going to see is what we see in our communities everywhere now, is this underclass of that we have abandoned completely.
Stratification.
That we no longer hold accountable for their behavior, and that we've now given basically permission to live in a lifestyle that in the long run is going to be detrimental to our communities. I mean, you can't. There was a great Tucker Carlson had a nice gentleman that was talking, and he was commenting upon the fact that, where is the environmental groups and lobbies rising up in protest and outrage about the fact that you have 60,000 plus people living on the streets of Los Angeles, defecating, urinating, and throwing all their waste into the sewer system, which is rolling out into the oceans. And you're seeing already beaches being closed and not being able to swim in certain areas, not being able to recreate in certain areas because the waste level is too high in these areas for safe utilization by the public. And yet nobody's crying outrage. No one's yelling a foul. I mean, that basically he's saying you have a town basically of 60,000 people that are just basically you're allowing all the waste to just go out into the public without being treated in any way, shape, or form. And where is the outrage? Where is the environmentalists crying a foul? They're not to be heard.
AOC, the Green New Deal, the hypocrites, the people that live in the gated communities, the people that have a lot of money, and yet they, the ones that fly in their private jets to talk about climate change. There's the Niobe people, not in my backyard, and as long as it's out of sight, out of mind, nobody says, well, I can't change it. It's bigger than I am. And then you wonder why people don't attend the Board of Supervisors and the City Council meeting. You wonder why people don't register to vote, because they feel that I can't fight City Hall, I can't fight Sacramento, I can't fight Washington, D.C., I am powerless, and I'm going to stay that way until something hits me square in the eye like a shooter at Walmart. Wait a minute. Now we have to have laws. Now we have to have this stamping out of forest fire that's going to affect us all. Well, it's really true. Where until this problem is on your doorstep, most people don't care. They talk to the people in Chicago who have these kind of killings on a weekly basis. I mean, we're talking 20, 30 people per week, every week, 52 weeks of the year, and there's no outrage. And they asked the people, they had interviews with the people there, and they said, why aren't you on the evening news? They don't care about us. We don't count.
Yeah. Oh, I had the a wonderful laugh because I went to Ashland this over the last few days, and they have a wonderful musical play over there named Hairspray. And I don't know if you remember Hairspray.
I do.
Anyway, the movie's great. John Travolta plays a wonderful role. Before transsexuals or transvestites were popular, he did a great role playing the mom in that role. But there is an opening number, Good Morning Baltimore, because this whole play takes care in Baltimore, and the singer comes out and says, and this was 93, I think, the movie came out. Good morning, Baltimore, and the rats dancing for me on the streets, So the rat infestation, and that is not a code word for racist in any way, shape, or form. You can call rats an infestation because that's what they are. But the rat infestation department in Baltimore apparently has been going on at least since and before they wrote Hairspray.
Yeah.
They said they were removing the trash in Baltimore and going through a large pile of trash, and they found newspapers 20 years old. So apparently they haven't been taking care of this problem for a long time in Baltimore. But we see, unfortunately, unless it's in your face and you're willing to take care of it and do the work yourself and make the changes necessary. When I was a young officer in 1979 coming to Crescent City, that was a priority for us. We made contact with every panhandler, every person walking out in the street, everyone, and there was no camping in the street, and there was no camping anywhere in the city limits. It was unless it was a campsite or campground. You could camp anywhere there, but there were very few inside the city limits. I mean, you had Shoreline and you had a couple others that you could go camp at, but that was it. And if there was an authorized campsite, there was no camping. There was no no loitering, no panhandling. I mean, we were able to make these contacts and take care of a lot of these problems. But again, the enforcement was there back then, and we don't see that. There's no holding people accountable for their behavior anymore.
And the signs are down. Why can't we at least put the signs back up?
Yeah, they used to be there. So
why can't we put them back up?
I have no idea. You'd have to talk to the city council about that one.
One of the things flashes before my mind is, if I can continue with the thought, is, and I'm having a hard time here. I lost it.
Well, in a sense, we're all drowning in this problem. And those of us that can keep our head above the water are just continuing to do that. But we need people to help because we're all drowning in this in a way.
One of the things that happened recently is this issue with President Trump on the 2020 ballot in California.
Right.
And Gavin Newsom, and the issue of sanctuary cities, the sanctuary state, and then there's the issues that have arisen from California's gun controls, and the states. Specifically, I'm looking at Washington and Oregon. Some of the counties have gone so far as to to regard themselves as Second Amendment sanctuaries,
Yeah,
where the sheriff and the police have banded together with the community because they have a heritage of firearm use, and say, we will not abide by your restrictions. Our freedom of firearm possession will not be infringed, and basically their ordinances, I guess, have held up. And I know they're always up, in front of a Supreme Court arguing about it. But if we can, if counties can say, well, if you want to do that, that's fine. But this particular population doesn't agree with those laws, regulations, or whatever the instrument is for enforcement. If the community in which it's supposed to be applied doesn't agree with it, do they have a recourse?
Yes, they they do. First of the one, Gavin Newsom in his law that they just recently passed about requiring the presidents to release their presidential candidates to release their tax. It's unconstitutional. It's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution dictates exactly what requirements are there for the president. Any person to run for president.
Political theater.
It's purely political theater. It's going to be ruled unconstitutional. No state can require anything other than what's already in the Constitution. They have to be 35. They have to be a natural citizen of the United States. They have to be,
That's it.
It's already dictated in the Constitution. They can't add things to the Constitution. So they're out of luck. They're not going to be able to. It'll be overturned shortly. But towards the when I was sheriff, California was itching to pass a magazine, high capacity magazine ban, and they wanted to make it retroactive. They wanted it to because they already had a ban, and they had grandfathered in anyone that had possession of high capacity magazines for their AR prior to, I think it was 86 or 89. I can't recall right now exactly the year, but if you had them prior to that, those were going to be legal. They were grandfathered in. They were not going to be banned. But the new law that they wanted to pass would make those completely, even the ones that they had grandfathered in prior, suddenly illegal. So you were going to turn suddenly someone who has there's nothing criminal about them, just because they possess these types of
Just like
magazines,
that.
instantaneously you would make them a
Instant
criminal.
felon.
And I told them that it's unconstitutional, and as a sheriff, I won't enforce this law in my community. I mean, I'm just not going to do it. I already know it's unconstitutional. I don't need a court to tell me it's unconstitutional. It's clearly unconstitutional, and as a sheriff, I'm just not going to enforce that.
And you have the weight to do that constitutionally.
Well, that's kind of an insult.
No. Don't take it personal.
But yes, as sheriff, you can do that. Now, it holds to your agency, but it doesn't necessarily impact the city or a city's chief, and it doesn't necessarily impact the state law enforcement entity. Like Oregon has the state police; they could be forced by their commander or by their I'm not sure what they call the head of the Department of Oregon State Police, but if their chief so ordered them to enforce within that county, they could clearly do so, because it's a state law and they're a state agency.
Oh, okay. I was kind of sort of wanting to do a little bridge for Joan because she wants to get into this Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on the homeless issue, and saying, well, if they may have an issue or a ruling, if you have a township or a city or a county, say, well, that's all well and fine if that's what you want. We, the members of this community, don't necessarily want to abide by it, and we will pass a law that says we will not follow that law, ruling, whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of leeway in that law,
Mm-hmm.
because the ruling as it is, it basically reiterated the human right to rest.
Fourth, Eighth Amendments.
That you cannot deny someone the human need for rest. And so if someone is resting, in an area, you can not deny them the ability to rest. There were caveats within their decision. One of course, which was that if it was on public land, because it's public land, they can clearly rest. There's nothing you can do. It does not say that you can allow them to set up tents or campsites or any of those things. That's purely within the guidelines of your community if you want to allow them to do so. Mm-hmm. But if someone's resting for 6, 7 hours or 4 hours or whatever, you have no legal right to say, no, you cannot rest here, if it's a public land. And as long as it's not violating any other law, such as obstructing a walkway or a pathway or a roadway or creating a hazard in any way, shape, or form. Again, there are a lot of caveats, and the law clearly, or the district said that, if you set aside a area for them to camp, then you can forbid it anywhere else within your communities. And so, it just requires the community to establish an area if they so choose. If not, then basically they can enforce the laws that they have on the books as long as they don't physically not allow someone to rest if they're resting.
And it's 5 o'clock. We're right on the hour. KFUG, KFUG, at 101.1 on your FM dial in Crescent City, California. Go ahead, Joan.
I was at a Board of Supervisors meeting at which Lieutenant Colonel David Cooper gave a talk and said we need a staging area, which is what you're talking about. And Laurie Cowan is chairman. And after he finished, Laurie Cowan said, "We've done all that." Totally a lie. I mean, he's saying we need a staging area and everything you said, a place that they can go. And so we need to change our supervisors. That's my main point. I couldn't believe it. She said, we've already done that. It's,
It's unknown by me, but I appreciate your time, Joan.
Okay.